July 1943. At 25,000 feet above northern Italy, the sky had turned thin, cold, and almost colorless as a formation of German Bf-109. Fighters climbed toward a group of American bombers, moving north across the mountains. Inside the cockpit, Oberleutnant Karl Weber of Jagdgeschwader 53 adjusted the oxygen mask beneath his helmet and watched the silver dots ahead grow larger against the pale blue horizon. Intercepting bombers had become routine for Luftwaffe pilots by that stage of the war. American crews believed altitude protected them, and German fighters had spent years proving that belief wrong. Weber pushed the throttle forward, and his Messerschmitt surged upward through the thin air, the Daimler-Benz engine vibrating through the airframe as he prepared to attack the bomber formation. But as the bombers came into clearer view, something strange appeared flying alongside them. At first, Weber thought two aircraft were flying unusually close together, but the shape refused to separate. The aircraft had long wings and two narrow fuselages stretching backward like arms, connected by a horizontal tail that made the entire silhouette look unfamiliar and almost experimental. The cockpit sat in a small center pod between the two booms, and the whole aircraft seemed larger than any escort fighter he expected to see, though Weber stared at it for a moment before laughing over the radio. "Was ist das?" he said to the other pilots. "It looks like two airplanes glued together." Several German pilots spotted the same aircraft and reacted the same way. Compared to the compact shape of the Bf-109 or the aggressive lines of the Focke-Wulf 190, the strange American fighter looked awkward and oversized. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to trust speed, agility, and simplicity in air combat. And this aircraft appeared to have none of those qualities. Twin engines meant extra weight. Twin tails meant unnecessary complexity. And a fighter that large seemed unlikely to turn well against the smaller German interceptors. From a distance, the aircraft almost looked experimental. Something rushed into service before the design had been properly refined. To many of the German pilots climbing toward the bomber formation, the unusual aircraft simply looked ridiculous. But the strange fighter escorting the bombers had not been designed to fight like a traditional interceptor. It was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and its unusual twin-boom shape hid advantages the German pilots could not yet see from their cockpits. Powered by two Allison engines equipped with turbo-superchargers, the aircraft could maintain full engine power in the thin air, far above 25,000 feet, where many fighters struggled to breathe. Now, at those altitudes, the P-38 could reach speeds above 400 miles per hour, while remaining stable enough to fire accurately during high-speed passes. Even more dangerous was the way its weapons were arranged. Instead of placing guns in the wings where their fire had to converge at a single distance, the Lightning carried everything in its nose: a 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, firing in a straight line directly ahead of the cockpit. Every round traveled toward the same target without losing accuracy at longer range. That meant a P-38 pilot could open fire from distances that surprised enemy fighters, delivering concentrated bursts capable of tearing through aircraft before the opponent fully realized the danger. None of the German pilots approaching the bomber formation knew those details yet. From their perspective, the aircraft ahead of them still looked strange, bulky, and easy to dismiss. Yet within months, that odd silhouette would become instantly recognizable across the skies of Europe. Because the fighter that German pilots were laughing at in the summer of 1943 would soon prove itself capable of climbing higher, striking harder, and flying farther than many aircraft sent to stop it. And when Luftwaffe pilots pushed their fighters above 25,000 feet and spotted those twin booms slicing through the clouds, they would learn something the hard way. The aircraft they had mocked was not just another escort fighter. It was a hunter waiting in the thin air above the battlefield. To understand why Luftwaffe pilots initially laughed at the P-38 Lightning, it helps to understand how fighter pilots in the early 1940s judged aircraft. Combat pilots trusted shapes they already understood. A good fighter, in their minds, had a narrow fuselage, a single, powerful engine in the nose, a tight wingspan, and a tail placed directly behind the cockpit. That was the pattern that had defined nearly every successful fighter since the beginning of the war. Germany's Messerschmitt B F-109 followed that philosophy perfectly: compact, light, and brutally efficient in a climb or tight turn. The Focke-Wulf 19 introduced later, followed the same logic with a slightly heavier but extremely aggressive design built around speed and firepower. When German pilots saw those aircraft, they instantly recognized a predator. The P-38 looked nothing like that. Instead of a single fuselage, though the American aircraft carried two long metal booms stretching backward from the wings, each housing an engine and ending in its own vertical tail. The pilot sat in a narrow pod suspended between them, with the nose projecting forward like the tip of a spear. From certain angles, the Lightning looked wide and awkward compared to the lean silhouette of German fighters. Even its wings seemed unusually long for a combat aircraft. To pilots trained to judge an opponent in seconds, that shape suggested a machine that would be heavy, slow to maneuver, and vulnerable in a turning fight. Twin engines reinforced that assumption. In most cases, twin-engine aircraft were bombers, reconnaissance planes, or heavy fighters designed for long range rather than agility. German pilots believed a twin-engine fighter would struggle to turn with smaller interceptors. They expected it to lose energy quickly in combat and become an easy target if the fight tightened into close-range maneuvering. The Luftwaffe's early experience with Allied aircraft strengthened that belief. During the first years of the war, many American and British fighters had indeed struggled against German designs. Early models of the P-40 and Hurricane lacked the climb performance and high-altitude power to challenge experienced German pilots. Even when those aircraft were dangerous at low altitude, German pilots had learned they could often control the engagement by climbing higher and choosing when to attack. That experience created a sense of confidence that bordered on arrogance. When reports began circulating about a new American twin-engine fighter escorting bombers, many German pilots assumed it would simply be another heavy aircraft attempting to perform a job better suited for lighter machines. When the wide wingspan of the P-38 seemed to confirm that assumption. Wide wings meant drag. Drag meant slower turning and reduced agility. German pilots believed they could simply outmaneuver the Lightning if it ever tried to fight them in close quarters. Even the aircraft's twin tails looked unusual enough to inspire jokes among pilots encountering it for the first time. Some Luftwaffe crews reportedly described the aircraft as looking like two planes connected by a bridge of metal. None others joked that the Americans must have run out of parts and decided to build a fighter from leftovers. But what the German pilots were seeing was not a clumsy compromise. The strange shape of the P-38 had been engineered for a very specific reason. The twin booms allowed two powerful engines to sit far apart on the wings, while leaving the center fuselage free for weapons, fuel, and the pilot. The long wings improved lift in thin air, giving the aircraft excellent performance at high altitude. And the large structure that looked heavy from a distance actually hid a fighter capable of climbing quickly and maintaining power where many single-engine aircraft began to struggle. In other words, the features that made the Lightning look awkward to experienced German pilots were the same features that would soon give it an unexpected advantage in the skies above Europe. The strange shape of the P-38 Lightning was not an accident of experimentation or a desperate wartime compromise. It was the result of a very deliberate engineering decision made years before the aircraft ever met German fighters over Europe. In the late 1930s, the United States Army Air Corps asked American aircraft designers to build something radically different from traditional fighters. They wanted an interceptor that could climb fast, fly extremely high, and maintain speed over long distances while carrying heavy weapons. Lockheed's engineers answered that challenge with a design that broke almost every visual rule of fighter aircraft at the time. Instead of forcing a single engine to deliver both speed and altitude performance, the P-38 carried two Allison V-1710 engines mounted in separate booms along the wings. Each engine drove a large propeller and was paired with a turbo-supercharger system that allowed the engine to keep producing power even when the air became thin at extreme altitude. Most fighters began losing performance as they climbed above 20,000 feet because their engines struggled to pull enough oxygen from the air. The Lightning did not have that problem. Its turbo-superchargers compressed the thin air before feeding it to the engines, allowing them to maintain strong power output even far above the altitude where many fighters began to fade. This meant the P-38 could continue climbing and accelerating in conditions that weakened its opponents. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, the aircraft could reach speeds of more than 400 miles per hour, putting it among the fastest fighters operating in the sky. To German pilots used to judging enemy aircraft by appearance alone, that capability was almost impossible to guess from the outside. The Lightning's unusual layout also solved another problem that many fighters struggled with during the war: accurate firepower at longer ranges. Most fighters carried guns in the wings, which meant their bullets traveled toward each other from both sides of the aircraft. To make those rounds meet the same point in front of the plane, engineers had to angle the guns inward so their fire converged at a specific distance. Outside that distance, the bullets spread apart again, reducing accuracy. The P-38 avoided that limitation entirely. Because its engines were mounted in the wing booms, the entire nose of the aircraft remained free for weapons. Engineers placed four .50 caliber machine guns and a powerful 20mm cannon directly in the nose, all aligned to fire straight ahead along the center line of the aircraft. Instead of crossing paths at a fixed convergence point, every round traveled in the same direction from the moment it left the barrel. The result was a tight, concentrated stream of fire that remained effective at distances where wing-mounted guns lost accuracy. For a P-38 pilot diving toward an enemy fighter, that meant he could open fire earlier and deliver a devastating burst before the opponent realized he was under attack. Combined with the aircraft's high-altitude speed and long range, this firepower transformed the Lightning into a dangerous interceptor, capable of striking bombers or fighters in the thin air where fewer aircraft could operate effectively. The German pilots, laughing at its silhouette in 1943, were looking at the shape of an aircraft designed for a different kind of combat, one that relied on altitude, speed, and concentrated firepower rather than tight turning fights. And the moment those advantages appeared in real combat, the jokes about the strange twin-boom fighter would begin to disappear. The first time German fighter pilots truly understood what the P-38 Lightning could do, it happened the same way many air combat lessons were learned during the war: suddenly, violently, and without warning. By the middle of 1943, American bomber formations were pushing deeper into Axis-controlled territory across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their strategy relied on altitude. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator climbed high into the thin air, where defensive guns had a better view and enemy fighters struggled to perform. German interceptors would scramble to meet them, climbing rapidly to break through the escort fighters and attack the bombers before they reached their targets. On one such mission, a formation of American bombers moved across northern Italy under the protection of several squadrons of P-38 Lightnings. From the ground, the German radar stations tracked the incoming aircraft and alerted nearby fighter bases. Within minutes, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were climbing hard toward the formation, pilots expecting another familiar encounter with American escort fighters. As they approached the bomber stream, some German pilots immediately noticed the strange twin-boom aircraft escorting the bombers. Many of them had seen the Lightning before and still regarded it as an unusual but unimpressive design. The German plan was simple: dive toward the bombers at high speed, break through the escort fighters, and scatter the formation before defensive gunners could react. It was a tactic that had worked many times before. But as the interceptors closed the distance, something unexpected happened. The P-38 escorts did not attempt to turn tightly with the approaching German fighters. Instead, the strange twin-boom fighters suddenly transformed from distant shapes into fast-moving attackers dropping out of the sky. One Bf-109 pilot later described the experience in combat reports as being attacked by an aircraft that appeared almost out of nowhere from above the formation. The Lightning pilots used altitude as a weapon. By climbing higher before engaging, they stored energy that could be converted into speed during a dive. As the P-38's dropped toward their targets, their nose-mounted guns fired concentrated bursts long before many German pilots expected accurate fire. The effect was immediate. A Bf-109 attempting to climb toward the bombers suddenly found heavy machine gun fire ripping through its fuselage from hundreds of yards away. Another pilot reported seeing a Lightning flash past at high speed, its guns firing continuously as it streaked through the formation before climbing away again. German pilots quickly realized that trying to turn with the P-38 during those attacks was nearly impossible because the American fighter did not stay long enough to fight that way. Instead, it struck quickly from above, fired a devastating burst, and used its speed to escape before the German fighters could reposition. Within minutes, the engagement had changed completely. What began as a confident interception of American bombers turned into a chaotic defensive fight against escort fighters that seemed far faster and more heavily armed than expected. German pilots, who had mocked the Lightning's unusual design, were suddenly facing a fighter that attacked from higher altitude, fired with frightening accuracy, and disappeared before they could respond effectively. It was the first clear lesson that the aircraft they had dismissed was capable of far more than its strange silhouette suggested. For the American pilots flying the P-38 Lightning, those early encounters with German fighters quickly proved that the aircraft's unusual design was more than a technical experiment. It became a machine they learned to trust with their lives during some of the most dangerous escort missions of the war. One of those pilots was Lieutenant Robert Bob Kelso of the 1st Fighter Group, a P-38 unit assigned to protect American bombers operating over southern Europe. The escort duty was one of the most exhausting roles a fighter pilot could perform. Instead of quick interceptions near friendly territory, escort missions required hours of flying at high altitude while maintaining position around slow-moving bomber formations. The air was brutally cold, above 25,000 feet, and the thin atmosphere forced pilots to rely on oxygen masks that made communication and breathing uncomfortable during long flights. On one particular mission in late 1943, Kelso's squadron was assigned to escort a formation of B-24 bombers targeting rail yards in northern Italy. The bombers climbed slowly toward their cruising altitude, while the P-38's spread out above and around the formation, forming a protective screen designed to intercept any enemy fighters approaching the bombers. Kelso remembered scanning the sky constantly during those flights, because German interceptors could appear at any moment, dull climbing rapidly toward the formation before diving into attack positions. Hours into the mission, the first warning came over the radio from another pilot flying higher above the bombers. German fighters were climbing from the north. Kelso spotted them seconds later, small, dark shapes gaining altitude quickly as they attempted to reach the bomber formation before the escort fighters could intercept them. Instead of waiting for the enemy to attack the bombers, Kelso pushed his P-38 into a climb above the approaching German fighters. That maneuver was one of the Lightning's greatest strengths. While many aircraft struggled to maintain power at those altitudes, the twin Allison engines and turbo-superchargers of the P-38 allowed it to continue climbing strongly in the thin air. Kelso watched the German fighters grow larger beneath him as he positioned his aircraft directly above their path. Then, he rolled the Lightning onto its side and began a steep dive toward the formation of Bf-109s climbing below. The speed built quickly, as gravity and engine power combined to accelerate the aircraft. In seconds, the German fighters filled the windscreen. Kelso lined up his gun sight and squeezed the trigger. The Lightning's nose-mounted weapons fired as a single concentrated stream of fire, and he watched tracers streak toward the nearest German fighter. He recalled being surprised at how early he could open fire and still see rounds hitting the target. The Bf-109 suddenly rolled violently as the burst struck its wing root, and smoke began trailing behind it as the aircraft dropped away from the formation. Kelso pulled the Lightning upward again, the climbing back toward altitude while other P-38 pilots repeated the same diving attacks from above. Within minutes, the German interceptors were forced to abandon their climb toward the bombers and scatter across the sky to avoid the repeated high-speed passes of the Lightning escorts. For the bomber crews watching from their formations below, the strange twin-boom fighters circling above them had just prevented another dangerous interception. And for Kelso and the other P-38 pilots, the engagement reinforced something they were beginning to understand about their aircraft. When used correctly, climbing above the enemy, diving with speed, and striking with concentrated fire, the Lightning was not just a capable fighter. It was a powerful guardian of the bomber formations, flying through hostile skies. As more P-38 squadrons entered combat across Europe and the Mediterranean, American commanders began to understand that the Lightning was not just another escort fighter. It required a different style of air combat entirely. Early in the war, many fighter pilots on both sides relied heavily on tight turning battles, where aircraft circled each other in close-range dogfights. Those engagements rewarded light aircraft with excellent maneuverability. The something German fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-19 were particularly good at. But the P-38 Lightning was built around a different philosophy. It was heavier than many single-engine fighters and carried more equipment, including its second engine, large fuel supply, and powerful nose-mounted weapons. Instead of forcing the Lightning into turning fights, where smaller aircraft might have an advantage, American pilots began to exploit the qualities that made the aircraft unique. One of those advantages was altitude. With turbo-supercharged engines capable of maintaining power high in the thin air, the P-38 could climb above many enemy fighters and position itself for attacks from superior height. Altitude meant energy, and energy meant control of the fight. Pilots learned that by climbing above incoming enemy aircraft, they could convert altitude into speed during a dive, strike quickly, and then climb away again before the opponent could respond. This tactic became known as energy fighting, or more specifically the boom and zoom method. Instead of circling endlessly with enemy fighters, the P-38 would attack with a fast diving pass, fire its concentrated nose weapons, and then use its speed to escape the engagement before the enemy could trap it in a turning battle. The Lightning's stability at high speed made these attacks particularly effective because the aircraft remained controllable even during steep dives that pushed it toward very high speeds. This new style of combat forced German pilots to adapt in ways they had not expected when they first encountered the unusual American fighter. Instead of facing opponents that tried to turn with them, Luftwaffe pilots increasingly found themselves under sudden attacks from above. P-38 pilots would appear at high altitude, dive at tremendous speed, fire a burst of heavy machine gun and cannon fire, and then climb away before the German fighters could reposition for a counterattack. Because the Lightning's weapons were mounted in the nose, even brief firing passes could be extremely dangerous. A short burst delivered from the correct angle could destroy an aircraft before the German pilot fully understood where the attack had come from. As American squadrons refined these tactics, the Lightning became more than just a bomber escort. It turned into a high-altitude interceptor, capable of controlling large sections of sky above bomber formations. German pilots climbing toward American bombers now had to worry about enemy fighters attacking from even higher altitude, forcing them to split their attention between reaching the bombers and defending themselves from diving attacks. The effect was subtle, but important. Each time German fighters were forced to maneuver defensively, they lost speed and position, making it harder to reach the bombers they were trying to destroy. Over time, the presence of P-38 escorts changed the rhythm of air combat above Europe. The strange twin-boom fighter that German pilots had once dismissed as awkward and oversized was now influencing how both sides fought in the thin air above 25,000 feet. The growing success of the P-38 Lightning in combat was not only the result of clever engineering or improved tactics, it was also the result of something far less visible from the cockpit of a fighter aircraft: American industrial power. By the middle of the war, the United States had begun producing aircraft on a scale that few nations could match. Factories across the country were operating around the clock, turning raw materials into fighters, bombers, and transport aircraft at an astonishing rate. Lockheed's production lines in California became one of the key centers for building the Lightning. The twin-boom fighter was not a simple aircraft to manufacture. Its two-engine design required more components than many single-engine fighters, and the aircraft's turbo-supercharger system added another layer of complexity. Yet American factories were built to handle that complexity. The assembly lines were organized so that different sections of the aircraft could be constructed simultaneously before being brought together for final assembly. Wings, engines, fuselage components, and tail sections moved through the factory like pieces of a massive mechanical puzzle. The result was a steady stream of new aircraft leaving the factory and heading toward training bases and combat units overseas. Over the course of the war, more than 10,000 P-38 Lightnings would be produced. That number mattered because air warfare was not decided by a single aircraft design, but by how many of those aircraft could reach the battlefield. Every new Lightning arriving in Europe meant another escort fighter, capable of climbing above bomber formations and defending them during long missions over enemy territory. For German air defenses, the growing number of American escort fighters created a problem that was difficult to solve. At the start of the war, German interceptors could often attack Allied bombers with limited resistance because escort fighters lacked the range to accompany the bombers deep into enemy territory. The P-38 began to change that equation. With its long range and twin-engine reliability, the Lightning could travel far beyond the distance most earlier fighters could reach. That meant bomber formations flying across Europe were increasingly protected by escort fighters during larger portions of their missions. Each additional Lightning squadron increased the difficulty for German pilots attempting to intercept those bombers. The numbers began to tell a clear story. If a bomber formation was escorted by dozens of fighters, capable of climbing high and attacking interceptors from above, German pilots had fewer opportunities to reach the bombers themselves. Instead of focusing entirely on attacking the bomber stream, they now had to defend themselves against escort fighters diving toward them at high speed. Even when German fighters managed to break through the escort screen, the presence of additional Lightning squadrons made the battle far more dangerous than it had been earlier in the war. American factories continued producing new aircraft month after month, replacing combat losses and expanding the number of operational units. The Lightning's unusual silhouette, once mocked by German pilots who first encountered it, began appearing in greater numbers across the skies of Europe. And with each new squadron that arrived, the aircraft's influence on the high-altitude air war continued to grow. By late 1943 and early 1944, German pilots had begun to understand that the unusual American fighter they once mocked was not a curiosity, but a serious threat in the skies above Europe. Combat reports from Luftwaffe units increasingly mentioned encounters with the twin-boom aircraft, escorting American bombers, or patrolling at high altitude. Pilots who had once joked about its appearance now described a fighter that behaved very differently from most aircraft they faced. Instead of engaging in long turning battles, the Lightning appeared suddenly from higher altitude, attacked with heavy bursts of fire, and then disappeared upward again before German fighters could organize an effective response. These sudden diving attacks were difficult to counter because the P-38 often began the engagement with more energy and speed than the aircraft climbing toward the bomber formation. The German pilots learned quickly that chasing a Lightning during one of these passes rarely worked. By the time they turned to pursue it, the American fighter was already climbing back toward altitude, where its turbo-supercharged engines allowed it to maintain strong performance. The result was a frustrating kind of engagement for Luftwaffe pilots who were used to forcing opponents into close-range maneuvering fights. Instead of controlling the battle, they increasingly found themselves reacting to attacks from above. The Lightning's nose-mounted guns also contributed to this growing respect. German pilots reported that bursts of fire from the aircraft often arrived earlier than expected during a head-on or diving pass. Because the guns were grouped together in the nose, the stream of bullets remained tightly concentrated even at longer ranges, giving the P-38 pilot the ability to open fire sooner than fighters with wing-mounted guns. Over time, these experiences forced German fighter units to reassess their early assumptions about the aircraft. Luftwaffe intelligence officers studying combat reports began noting that the Lightning's greatest strengths appeared at high altitude, where its engines continued producing strong power, and its pilots could use speed to control the engagement. Pilots were warned not to underestimate the aircraft, simply because of its unusual shape, though some German flyers even began describing the Lightning as a dangerous opponent if allowed to fight on its own terms. Rather than dismissing the design, they learned to respect its ability to appear suddenly above a formation and deliver a concentrated attack before climbing away again. The aircraft that once looked oversized and awkward from a distance now carried a reputation for striking quickly and with surprising firepower. This shift in perception marked an important moment in the air war over Europe. Early mockery had been replaced by cautious recognition that the American twin-boom fighter possessed qualities that could not be ignored. German pilots climbing toward bomber formations now watched the sky above them far more carefully than before. Because if the distinctive silhouette of a P-38 appeared high in the sunlight above 25,000 feet, it usually meant an attack was about to begin. And by the time the first tracers streaked past the cockpit, it was often too late to avoid the encounter. By the final years of the war, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning had firmly established itself as one of the most recognizable and versatile fighters in the skies over Europe and the Mediterranean. The aircraft that German pilots once laughed at had proven capable of performing roles that few fighters of its time could match. Its twin-engine design gave it long range and reliability during missions that stretched deep into hostile territory. Its turbo-supercharged engines allowed it to operate effectively in the thin air above 25,000 feet, where many aircraft struggled to maintain power. And its concentrated nose-mounted weapons delivered bursts of fire powerful enough to destroy enemy aircraft before they could react. Those qualities turned the Lightning into a valuable escort for American bombers flying dangerous missions across Axis-controlled territory. Every time a formation of B-17's or B-24's climbed toward enemy targets, P-38 fighters often climbed above them, forming a protective shield against intercepting aircraft. German pilots attempting to reach the bombers now had to pass through a screen of escort fighters, capable of diving from higher altitude and striking with heavy firepower. Even when German interceptors managed to slip past the escort screen, the presence of the Lightning made those attacks far riskier than they had been earlier in the war. The aircraft's ability to climb, dive, and fire accurately at high speed allowed it to disrupt many interception attempts before they could fully develop. In the end, the P-38 Lightning represented something larger than a single successful aircraft design. It demonstrated how unconventional engineering solutions could create entirely new advantages in aerial combat. The twin-boom structure, that once seemed strange and unnecessary, turned out to be the key to combining two powerful engines, long wings, and a centralized weapon system into a single aircraft capable of performing multiple roles. German pilots, who encountered the Lightning later in the war, rarely mocked its appearance. By then, the distinctive silhouette had become instantly recognizable across the skies of Europe. Two long booms extending behind the wings, twin vertical tails, connected by a horizontal stabilizer. A narrow cockpit pod sitting between them like the nose of a spear cutting through the clouds. For many Luftwaffe pilots, spotting that shape high above the bomber formations meant one thing. An American fighter was already watching the battle from a higher altitude, waiting for the right moment to dive. With the aircraft that once looked awkward from a distance had proven itself capable of dominating the thin air where the high-altitude war was fought. And the twin-boom fighter that German pilots once dismissed as strange had quietly become one of the hunters of the European skies. If you enjoy stories about the aircraft and technology that shaped World War II, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the machines and strategies that defined the war in the skies.